Good day. Today is Wednesday, 29th October 2025. And before I proceed with this video, let me remind you again to tick the like button if once you've listened or watched the video, you decide that you like what you've listened or watched and wish to indicate and confirm that fact. Anyway, let me now proceed with the video. And of course, what has now happened is that President Trump has arrived in South Korea. He has been given various decorations and orders. He's been allowed to wear various items of South Korean, or rather of Korean regalia. And he has negotiated another trade agreement with the South Korean government, which is, of course, a long-standing ally of the United States. And from what I can tell, and as of the present moment in time, the details are sketchy. But from what I can tell, what Trump has agreed to is a certain reduction in tariffs, the tariffs that he has imposed on South Korean exports to the United States in return for a promise from South Korea to invest, I believe it is $350 billion in the United States. Now, I will make a number of very brief points about this before moving on to further topics in this program. This is becoming now the pattern. Trump imposes tariffs, negotiates, gets the other side to agree to payment of a very, very large amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars of money to the United States. Trump reduces the tariffs. I don't think that Trump perhaps fully understands the extent to which, in the worst sense, this looks like a policy of, well, Chicago 1920s style protection rather than protectionism. It looks very much, in fact, to me, like a kind of protection racket, a shakedown of countries that want to trade with the United States. You go through the motions of imposing tariffs upon them, and then you get them to agree to pay you large sums of money in return. Now, the other problem with this is that, quite apart from the fact that this is not an attractive way of doing business, and that's putting it mildly, the other problem with that is that, of course, the money that Trump believes he's getting these countries to agree to pay to the United States, it's entirely unclear how, to me at least, they're going to pay it. I mean, we've discussed this previously in earlier programs about the European Union agreeing to invest astronomical sums of money in the United States. There's still no real clear explanation of how that's going to be done, or what mechanisms are going to be set up in order to make it happen, or what the timeline, the detailed timeline, is going to be. The same, I suspect, is going to turn out to be true with South Korea. These trade partners of the United States are offering or pretending to offer money to the United States, which I suspect, in some cases at least, they have no real intention of ever actually providing. In the meantime, Trump is able to come back and declare that he's raised the tariffs and got the other side to agree to invest huge amounts in the United States, and then he moves on. It seems to me a very, very strange way to conduct trade policy, and as we'd seen with China especially, it doesn't work. Anyway, that's one thing I would say about this affair. I would also say something else, which is that I understand that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to make a decision very soon. Some say some say next week, on the whole constitutional propriety of Trump's tariff policies. I am not going to get into the details of this. This is a matter of American constitutional law. I have already said that simply from reading the US Constitution, it seems to me very difficult to justify what Trump has been doing. He has tried to justify the various tariffs that he has imposed by alleging that they are there to address some kind of economic emergency. The lower courts have been, well, frankly, unconvinced by that argument. Well, whatever one can say about it, my own sense is that the argument, such as it is being undermined further by use of tariffs in this way. They're not looking like so much like a revenue-raising measure, at least a taxation measure. They're looking like, as I said, a protection racket intended to shake down America's trading partners, some of whom, of course, are America's allies and friends. Anyway, this is the approach that President Trump is increasingly taking in his conduct of international relations on behalf of the United States. And, of course, it is not entirely, in fact, it is all of a piece with what basically happened between himself and Putin in Anchorage. I've discussed this now in several programs. I pointed out that Lavrov has provided us with complete clarity now about what happened in Anchorage. Trump, through his envoy, Steve Witkoff, proposed a deal to the Russians relating to the conflict in Ukraine. I've discussed the terms of that deal already. I said that undoubtedly it meant that Ukraine would not be able to join NATO. Undoubtedly it involved a Ukrainian pullback from Donbass. Probably it involved a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and I strongly suspect that it also included provisions which brought it close or closer to Istanbul Plus. Anyway, Putin was lured to Anchorage, met with Trump and Witkoff there, asked them if he'd understood the proposal properly, went through the proposal clause by clause, said after he'd got confirmation from Witkoff that his understanding of the proposal was accurate and correct, that he, on behalf of Russia, was prepared to accept it, only for Trump to then walk away, saying that he needed more time to consult more widely, and then used the remaining weeks, the weeks that have followed, to do what people in this kind of situation and who behave in this sort of way also often do: raise his demands, demand an immediate ceasefire on the existing conflict lines without any further commitments to anything, badmouth Putin and the Russians at almost every opportunity, increase pressure upon them by threatening to deploy Tomahawk missiles and long-range missiles to Ukraine, and sanctioning their oil companies. It's not actually, if you think about it, that different from what we've just seen play out in South Korea. And the Russians, of course, very different from the South Koreans, in a very different position altogether. I think that Trump, like many people, does not fully grasp that there are pressures on Putin, domestic pressures, pushing in the other direction, that Putin is one of the relatively few people left in the Kremlin who believe in some kind of rapprochement with the United States. Anyway, Trump, presumably oblivious to all of this, it's how he behaves. He plays these games with his various people he negotiates with, imagines perhaps that this is the way towards achieving effective deal making. In reality, with the Russians, it destroys his credibility and undermines trust. Now, there's been an article by a Russian commentator and academic, Dmitry Trenin, which basically discusses all of this and shows, I think fairly accurately, the view of Trump which the Russians have now formed. And I will say straight away that it is an unflattering one. Now, it's worth saying that Trenin is somebody who has lived a long time in the United States, who is very much on the liberal end of the Russian foreign policy establishment, who has worked for many years to try to develop good relations between Russia and the United States, and who is in no sense, therefore, an advocate in Russia of endless confrontation with the United States, of which, by the way, increasing numbers of people in Russia today are. Anyway, this is what Trenin said in an article that has appeared in the major Russian newspaper, Kommersant, which, as its name implies, is also widely read by the Russian business community. He says this: Donald Trump's remarks frequently contradict one another. Following his train of thought can feel like a virtual roller coaster ride, dizzying, unpredictable, yet impossible to ignore. But one should not get carried away by the spectacle. Trump's tactics are straightforward. He can be abrasive and threatening one moment, charming and conciliatory the next. Now that makes him, to the Russians, sound manipulative. It is not a flattering view of Trump. When the Russians conduct negotiations with someone, they assume that the other side is being straightforward, or they want to believe that. At times, Trump presents himself as one of us, at others as one of them. The real question of whether there is a coherent strategy behind this chaos, 9 months into his second term, there is enough evidence to draw some cautious conclusions. First, Trump's ultimate goal is personal glory. He wants to go down as the greatest president in US history, the man who restored America's dominance and reshaped global politics. His strategic vision begins and ends with his own legacy. Again, this is perhaps not easy for Westerners to understand, but there is always, when Russians like this, a degree of implicit criticism. When Russian political leaders accuse their opponents of worrying about their place in history, they are not making a compliment, they're making a criticism. For the Russian, within the Russian political tradition, worrying about your future reputation as opposed to your country's interests is an unworthy thing. Just to say. Anyway, Trenin then continues. Second, Trump is determined to suppress America's economic rivals. In this, his policies are blunt but consistent. Tariffs, trade wars, the repatriation of production to US soil. For Trump, global competition is not about mutual gain, but national survival, which again begs the question of whether Trump really is somebody with whom Russia should be seeking to forge long-term trade and economic relations. If he thinks that it is to his advantage to reverse anything that he agrees in terms of trade policy, he will do so. And his whole approach ultimately is predatory and exploitative of those whom he works with. And then trading continues. Third, and most relevant for Russia, Trump wants to be seen as a global peacemaker. But in his vocabulary, peace really means truce. He is not interested in complex negotiations or long-term settlements. His aim is to get all sides into one room, stage a handshake, declare victory, and move on. Once the cameras are gone, the details and the responsibility are left to others. Should conflict resume, Trump can say he brought peace. It was others who spoiled it. The formula does not work with us. Moscow has tried to explain to Trump the real origins of the Ukrainian crisis and that Russia's conditions for peace are not maximalist demands, but the minimum basis for a lasting settlement. Trump, however, is uninterested in history or nuance. I've discussed this already. I've said previously that if it is true that Putin has at times tried to lecture Trump about the history of the Ukrainian conflict, Trump is completely wrong not to listen to what Putin is saying. For the Russians especially, history is absolutely important. It is vital in understanding any problem, any international problem, especially one like the problem of Ukraine. Anyway, training continues. Trump's focus is always the immediate result, the headline moment. After 8 months of dialogue, progress remains intermittent at best. And again, you can see what Trenin is saying. We spent 8 months trying to come to terms with this man, and we're going nowhere. And then Trenin also makes the further point, which goes very much to points that have been made by many others, Brian Beletic, Scott have calibrated, Putin himself on occasion, by the way. There are also external limits to Trump's freedom of action. For all his bluster, he is neither the King of America nor the Emperor of the West. He cannot ignore Washington's entrenched anti-Russian consensus shared by Democrats and many in his own Republican Party. Nor can he completely disregard US allies in Europe, however little he may respect them. Despite his self-image as a political maverick, Trump is still constrained by the machinery of the American establishment. And then Trenin does say something which is actually true and which is not just attempting to find some crumbs of comfort, saying to oneself, well, all of that effort over the last months to come to an agreement with Trump was all for nothing. Trenin says that the Russians did achieve something by it. Even so, the special diplomatic operation, notice the careful use of words, special diplomatic operation, the attempt to have a discussion, a dialogue with Trump, special diplomatic operation, of course, mirrors the special military operation that Russia is conducting in Ukraine. You can see that for the Russians, this has been the diplomatic outreach to Trump and the special military operation are seen as complementary with each other. Even so, the special diplomatic operation, Moscow's direct dialogue with the Trump administration, has served its purpose. It has demonstrated to Russia's partners, China, India, Brazil, the other BRICS states, the global south, that Moscow is genuinely committed to a fair and durable peace. It has shown Russia's soldiers and citizens that their leadership continues to pursue the declared objectives of the Ukrainian military operation. The very fact, in other words, that the Russians have engaged Trump in diplomacy and that he has tried to make them make unacceptable concessions, and that the Russian leadership, despite all the pressure, has refused to make those concessions, is confirmation to the Russian people and to the Russian leadership and to the Russian public that the Russian leadership, in pursuing Russian national interests, is to be trusted. So Russia's friends have been reassured that Russia is not simply there fighting a war just for victory. It's always been prepared to negotiate. The Russian people have been shown that despite that, the leadership is not going to make unacceptable concessions. And then Trenin makes the third point. It has also clarified for the Kremlin the limits of Trump's real power. He may pretend that he is somebody who by himself can somehow settle the conflict in Ukraine, but the reality is that he cannot go beyond the framework that the American political system imposes upon him, which is an anti-Russian one. So ultimately, it is futile expecting that a deal with him can be done. And then Trenin finishes. The talks may have slowed, but communication continues along two channels, Lavrov-Rubio and Dmitriev-Witkoff. Yet diplomacy, as ever, is not a substitute for strength. Its purpose is to consolidate what has been achieved on the battlefield. A diplomatic operation can assist, but it cannot replace a military one. So, the objective now must be to continue to fight the war, to achieve victory in that war. When that victory is achieved, the Russians will have maintained some kind of channel of communication to the United States, to Rubio and Witkoff, and perhaps potentially their successors. And at that point, with Russia in a much stronger position than the one it is in today, at that point, the Russians perhaps can return to this business of negotiations with the United States and can then use those negotiations to consolidate that which they have achieved. Not, in other words, to obtain friendship with the United States or a long-term rapprochement with the United States. Those illusions, if they ever existed, perhaps some people had them, maybe Putin did. Those illusions have gone. But the purpose of the negotiations of the future will be, in effect, like the negotiations that took place in the 1960s and 70s, to consolidate and formalize the outcome achieved through victory in the war. So that's, I think, actually a fairly clear summary of the Russian position. Trenin has always impressed me as being somebody who is very well informed about Russian thinking. Obviously, I don't know who he's been talking to in Moscow, but I do get the sense that what he is writing in this article reflects very closely what Russian thinking, official Russian thinking, is like today. And obviously the fact that it has been published in Kommersant means that that thinking is now being shared with Russia's business community as well. And I doubt, by the way, on their side, there will be any significant pushback against it. Now, before I finish on all of this, there is one further point I do want to make, and it's one which perhaps Donald Trump might want to bear in mind. I've said that some of his diplomatic initiatives, his use of tariffs, for example, to me have something of the hallmark of a 1920s Chicago protection racket. Well, if you want to conduct foreign policy and diplomacy in that kind of way, then do please remember that others can play dirty too. Now, I am not actually expecting the Russians to do this, but there will be a stenographic record of the discussions that took place between Putin and Trump and Putin and Witkoff in Anchorage. The Russians will have it all documented. And usually, in most negotiations, I believe the stenographic record is agreed by the sides. Perhaps it hasn't been in this case. But if one day the Russians decide to publish their stenographic record of these discussions, then the evidence of Trump's duplicity and weakness, which is how the Russians see it, will be there for everyone to see. Of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russians, Putin himself, directly after the meeting in Anchorage, in the belief that he and Trump had done a deal, telephoned all kinds of world leaders, including Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi and President Lula of Brazil and other leaders, and provided them with a detailed account of the Anchorage summit meeting. So obviously, if the stenographic record is ever published, it will not embarrass Trump with these world leaders because they already know about this. But in the United States, in Europe, it might be a different question. One wonders, for example, what Lindsey Graham and Alexander Stubb and people like that will say if the stenographic record is ever made public. Now, to say it again, it's not Russian practice to do this thing. I've never, in fact, remembered the Russians actually doing it. But they did come very close to doing it on one occasion. I remember that the EU Commission President at the time, in 2014, Barroso, made up a story that over the course of a meeting he had had with Putin, Putin told him that if he wished, Putin could order the Russian army to capture Kiev in 2 weeks. Putin was furious that Barroso had said such a thing. It turned out that Putin had said nothing like that at all. The Russians publicly complained. This was in 2014. They threatened to publish the stenographic record of the discussion between Putin and Barroso. And Barroso, who did not want the stenographic record published, retracted his account of his conversation with Putin and gave the Russians a groveling apology. So this is something, as far as I know, that the Russians have never actually done, but they did threaten to do it on one occasion. And I suspect they would have done it on that occasion if Barroso had dug in his heels. And, well, it might just be as well for Trump to be aware of the fact that the Russians do have an official record of what was actually said in Anchorage. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about all of this. Now, Trump, of course, is due to meet Xi Jinping. The Chinese continue to be very tight-lipped about the progress of the trade negotiations. My own strong instinct is, as I said, that nothing substantive has been achieved. And again, the can has been kicked down the road. Trump has been going to various countries, Japan and South Korea, and has been signing various agreements about rare earths, none of which make any real sense because the rare earths can all be found, as far as I understand, in the United States, on the territory of the United States itself. And the problem is not excavating rare earths, it is refining them. And none of these countries, not Japan, not South Korea, not the United States, have the technology for the moment to do that. And I've discussed in several programs how protracted and difficult obtaining and developing that technology would be. It would be a process of years, probably many years. I'm not going to say decades, but the United States, some people, perhaps Trump himself, no doubt, underestimate the challenges and the length of time it will take for it to be done. Anyway, the reality is, and there's been more and more articles squirreled away in parts of the financial media, the reality is that the Chinese have a trump card in terms of these negotiations. And of course, beyond that, they have also many, many other tools and pressure points against the United States that they can use, many more than the United States does with respect to China. And I noticed that there's been a long editorial in the Financial Times complaining about how China continues to invest in high technologies and industries and all of these things rather than boosting consumption and bailing out the property market, in which, by the way, Western investors like, a particularly famous American investor, are heavily over-invested, which is one reason why they have been calling so insistently for a bailout. The reality is that it is these heavy investments by China in its manufacturing industry that explains why China is in the dominant position in the trade negotiations with the United States, in which it in fact is. Now, on this point, there is one further observation that I'm going to make. President Trump has recently spoken about the need to develop a navy, a golden navy, I believe he calls it, to protect the Western Hemisphere from enemy nations, presumably China, perhaps Russia too. He speaks about establishing battleships, heavily armored battleships, equipped with sophisticated missiles. He talks about that. He's talked grandly about an Iron Dome being established to protect the United States. He's not addressed the question of with what resources the United States is going to do any of these things. United States shipbuilding industry has been in long-term decline for a very long time. It is now at a critical level, so much so that it's becoming increasingly difficult for the United States to produce warships. And it is being overtaken by China on a massive scale in this area. I recently read an analysis of the shipbuilding situation in the United States and Russia, and was incredulous to learn that Russia's total aggregate shipbuilding capacity now apparently exceeds that of the United States itself. This seems to me almost impossible to imagine. The Soviet Union did once have, long ago, a mighty shipbuilding industry, but it basically folded after the Soviet Union collapsed. I know that the Russians, over the last 10 years, have been working very hard to rebuild it. And of course, the shipbuilding industry in Russia is now headed by Nikolai Patrushev, a very, very well-connected Russian official indeed. Once Putin's national security advisor, a member of Russia's Security Council, and, by the way, a trained naval architect. But still, if it really is the case that Russia is able to has the capacity to outproduce the United States in shipbuilding, then things really have changed very, very much. But anyway, how is the United States going to create this mighty fleet unless it rebuilds its shipbuilding industry? Now, that in theory can be done, but it is a long-term strategic program that requires mobilization of enormous industrial resources. The United States can find those resources, but it needs the plan. And unless that is done, all talk of mighty hemispheric navies of this kind that can deter the Chinese is, frankly, a fantasy. The same applies with the Golden Dome over the United States. Again, a country that is struggling to produce missiles, that is now short of Patriot missile interceptors and THAAD missile interceptors, that cannot supply Ukraine with these interceptors because it is so short of them itself, that struggles to keep up supplies to America's allies, even as it tries to rebuild inventories, has an awful lot to do before it is able to recreate that kind of air defense system that Donald Trump is talking about. And again, there is little sign, in fact, there's no sign at all, of any of this happening. Trump also has a tendency to overstate the capability of American weapons relative to those of others. So he's spoken at length about the tremendous effectiveness of the Tomahawk missile system. He's downplayed the Burevestnik system that the Russians have. He says that American submarines are far better than anyone else's submarines. He says many things of that kind. Well, in missile technology, the United States has still not fielded hypersonic missiles or hypersonic glide vehicles. Both the Chinese and the Russians have done so. And of course, the Russians have used them in battle. The Russians not only have hypersonic ballistic missiles, they have a hypersonic cruise missile, which is the Zircon missile, which is now entering volume production and which is entering service with the Russian Navy. As I said, the United States doesn't have any comparable system. As for submarines, well, I have a high regard for the US Navy, and I believe that its submarine force is indeed extremely well run and very well managed. But I have to say this too. If one is looking at who is building the largest number of fully up-to-date, very modern submarines, at the moment it is the Russians, not the United States. Now, the United States does perhaps have advantages in other fields. I'm not going to discuss any of this at huge length. The United States, for example, fields far more fifth-generation fighter jets than other great powers do. But it does not have the overwhelming superiority that Donald Trump seems to imagine. As he's discovering in his trade negotiations with China, the United States cannot practice with China the kind of protection racket it has used against South Korea, Japan, the European Union, and any number of others, and which it is also trying to deploy against India as well. Against the Russians, its leverage is limited as well. It cannot change the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. The assumption that sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft are going to cripple the Russian economy are going to be shown fairly soon to be profoundly wrong. I doubt myself that there's going to be any significant decline in Russian oil exports over the medium term. Either there will be short-term falls, and for a time the Russians will probably have to quietly offer further big discounts, but the Russians will always find ways to sell their oil because it is in massive demand, and the United States anyway overstates the importance of the energy sector in the bigger Russian economy. So, Trump is being told and believes many things which, in my opinion, are out of date. Kellogg has told him that the Russian military are not as strong as people say. He's talked about how the Americans could defeat that military very easily. He is obviously wrong about that. And, well, the realities are that the Russians have shown consistently on the Ukrainian battlefields that they're able to respond and overcome all the advanced weapons that the United States has deployed to that war, that the United States and the Ukrainians have never been able to gain a technological advantage. And the Russians have also, as I discussed in my program yesterday, further demonstrated that they have staying power in this war, which the United States has repeatedly failed to show in all the many wars it has fought since the Second World War, since the war in Korea back in the 1940s and 1950s. So the balance is not as favorable, anywhere near as favorable to the United States as President Trump conducting foreign policy in this way that I've discussed seems to imagine. Lastly, I notice that Israel has now resumed bombing in Gaza. I was very skeptical about the longevity of the ceasefire that Trump claimed that he'd successfully negotiated in Gaza. I always thought that the prospects of that ceasefire enduring were very slim, though, let me repeat again, I hoped to be proved wrong about this. The latest Israeli bombing of Gaza perhaps is not the last end of the story, and it may be the case that things can still be retrieved and held together, and that the Gaza ceasefire has not yet been brought to the point of total collapse. Though, frankly, if bombing continues, it's difficult to see how a ceasefire can continue for very long. But I always thought that Trump was overselling the ceasefire, was declaring peace very prematurely, far too soon. And we go back to what Trenin said, and there's no doubt at all that Trenin also had the Gaza ceasefire in mind. Peace for Trump really means truce. He's not interested in complex negotiations or long-term settlements. His aim is to get all sides into one room, stage a handshake, declare victory, and move on. Once the cameras are gone, the details and the responsibilities are left to others. Should conflict resume, Trump can say he brought peace. It was others who spoiled it. Should conflict resume, Trump can say he brought peace. It was others who spoiled it. Isn't that exactly what he's going to do if there is a collapse of the ceasefire in Gaza? Anyway, let's move on. And let's now do that which Trenin also urged us to do, which is to focus on the military side. After all, as Trenin put it, a diplomatic operation can assist, but it cannot replace a military one. Diplomacy, as ever, is not a substitute for strength. It is the military developments that, in the end, shape the outcome. Anyway, let's go back to the situation in the conflict. And, well, the situation in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk continues to be one of cauldrons. Zelensky is talking more and more about Pokrovsk. He's talking about the fact that he's sending reinforcements to Pokrovsk to try to stabilize the situation there. He's talking in increasingly shrill terms. He says that Ukraine is going to conduct enormous attacks on the Russian energy system. He makes no attempt any longer, by the way, to conceal the fact that Ukraine is indeed undertaking these attacks. I remember how earlier in the war, when Ukraine launched attacks with drones on oil refineries in Russia, energy facilities in Russia, when it conducted drone attacks against the Kremlin itself, it went through the pretense that it wasn't going to comment, and who knows whose drones those were. And Western governments and the Western media basically, to a great extent, went along with that too. And I remember how a couple of months ago, earlier in Trump's term, Trump tried to impose an energy ceasefire, and the Russians said that they would go along with it and that they would agree. And they very quickly said that the Ukrainians were paying no attention to the ceasefire and that they were attacking Russian energy facilities. And I can remember that the Russians provided a lengthy document, apparently, to the Americans, to Rubio specifically, outlining all of these Ukrainian attacks on the Russian energy facilities. The Ukrainians, as I remember, were sort of pretending that this wasn't the case. Well, all of those pretenses, all of those have fallen away now. Zelensky, confident that he has Trump's backing, is now openly talking about the fact that he wants more and more attacks on the Russian energy system. And he is indeed sending drones to attack Russia, trying to destroy or damage energy facilities in Russia. So far as I can tell, these drones are becoming less effective. The Russians appear to have developed a fairly well organized system of defeating these drones. In fact, I read claims in Russia that the latest drone attack, which involved over 100 drones, was completely unsuccessful. Every single drone, without exception, was brought down, either kinetically, in other words, it was shot down, or it was brought down by electronic jamming. There have been other claims, by the way, about Ukraine's drone offensive that have been coming from the Russians as well. The Russians have themselves now been saying that even the biggest Ukrainian drones attacking refineries in Western Russia are able to do scant damage to these refineries, if only because the warheads that the drones carry are relatively small and can only do relatively light damage against giant industrial facilities. And I read somewhere else that Ukrainian drone attempts to conduct drone attacks on Russian energy installations deep in Russia's interior, in central Russia, in Siberia, in the Far East, are almost entirely ineffective, because in order to reach those sort of distances, Ukrainian drones need to tank up on large amounts of fuel. That reduces the weight of the warhead to almost nothing in order to compensate for the fuel that is carried. And that means that when the drones strike the buildings or the facilities that they're targeting, almost no actual damage is ever done. Just saying. So, Zelensky talks about this. He has massively oversold this campaign to the Western media, to Western journalists, to European governments, to the US government, to Donald Trump himself. He's given them the impression of a successful air campaign against Russian energy installations. He's given entirely distorted figures about Russian production of refined oil, of gasoline, which make extraordinary assumptions, in fact, obviously wrong assumptions, about the production totals of the refineries and the way in which these refineries operate. And, well, far too many people have believed them, and far too many people continue to repeat these stories. And Zelensky was forced to admit that there's been problems with the Flamingo drone missile. It has not yet entered service or production as he had promised. There have been technical problems of some sort. Nobody can say exactly what those problems are, but he says that he expects that they will all be resolved by the end of the year, that funding to mass produce the Flamingo missile has come from Europe. As I've said already, the Flamingo missile looks to be based on 1940s concepts with some technological improvements. It is slow and big, and though it does have a very long range, it is far from stealthy. I don't think the Russian air defences will have much difficulty coping with it if it ever does appear in any quantity. And, well, the one thing that does seem to have come from Putin's latest conversations with Trump, the one that took place 2 weeks ago now, is that Putin does seem to have made it very clear to Trump that deployment by the West of long-range missiles in Ukraine and attacks deep inside Russia with those missiles is indeed a Russian red line and would indeed provoke a strong Russian reaction. And for the moment at least, Trump does seem to have backed off that idea. It doesn't seem as if the Tomahawks are, for the moment at least, going to Ukraine. There is no sign yet that the Taurus missiles are being used for strikes against Russia. And we still have that tantalizing report about 10 days ago of a Ukrainian missile strike using British Storm Shadow missiles against the Russian chemical factory in the western Russian city of Bryansk. But amazingly, there have been no follow-up claims by the Ukrainians. I still myself haven't seen any satellite pictures. It's as if that incident never happened. Perhaps it didn't happen. Perhaps the Ukrainians did in fact make it all up, or perhaps, as the Russian Defense Ministry has sort of implied, all the missiles in question, the British Storm Shadows that were used in that attack, perhaps they were all in fact, as the Russians sort of suggest, shot down. Anyway, for the moment at least, it's all down to drones and Flamingo missiles, except that the Flamingo missile has not appeared, is not in production, and there is no certainty that it ever will be. And if it does get into production, I don't believe it's going to cause the Russians much worry. By the way, and for the record, since Andrei Belousov became Russian defense minister, the Russians have embarked on a massive program of hardening their air bases. Shelters have appeared for aircraft on more and more bases across Western Russia, in the area of the special military operation, and in Crimea. And that may be the reason why we're not hearing about drone attacks on those bases by Ukraine very much anymore. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that part of what Zelensky is saying. But having told everybody that the situation on the front lines was in deadlock, that Ukraine was holding its own, he's obviously not admitting that there is a cauldron in Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians vehemently deny the Russian claims about that, even though, from what I can see, these Russian claims are mostly acknowledged, not just by Russian, but by the neutral Western, if you like, many of the Western, the more reliable Western, and mapping and reporting projects. Anyway, Zelensky does now admit that there is a problem, that there is a crisis in Pokrovsk, and he is indeed sending troops to Pokrovsk. And, well, there have been the Ukrainian counterattacks. As I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the counterattacks from Grishinyo towards Rodinska had been successfully repelled. The Russians, for the moment, seem to be keeping the cauldron in Pokrovsk tightly shut. And I saw reports this morning about further Russian advances in Mirnograd and Pokrovsk itself. Several of the mapping projects have expanded significantly now the territory in Pokrovsk, which they say the Russians control. If these mapping projects are true, and much of their information appears to be based on video footage, not all of which I have seen, then it seems to me that the Ukrainians basically control, within Pokrovsk itself, only a small amount of territory, a small belt of territory, north of the railways in northeastern Pokrovsk. No doubt there are Ukrainian troops in other places in Pokrovsk, south of the railways, but they all appear to be isolated from each other and surrounded by the Russians, who appear to be methodically conducting mopping up operations within Pokrovsk. And there's now also confirmation that the Russians have captured the Dmitriev mine in Mirnograd, and they have also captured the Pokrovsk mine west of Pokrovsk as well. Apparently there's video footage of this now, and that opens the way for a further Russian advance from the territory of that mine to Grishinyo. If Grishinyo is attacked and captured, well, the whole cauldron is not only sealed shut, it is doubly sealed. I can't imagine that in that case anybody in Ukraine, at least within the leadership, would have any real doubt any longer that there is a crisis developing for the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk. And the Russians also claim to be advancing, by the way, in northern Mirnograd as well. So there is video footage of this also. If you put this all together, the overall impression from the Pokrovsk battle is of the Ukrainians being concentrated in a shrinking amount of territory, not all of which are the actual buildings. Some of it is open fields to the north of Pokrovsk, fields where the Russian drones, of course, regularly operate. And, well, the cauldron is getting smaller, and the noose, if you like, is tightening. And, of course, the smaller the cauldron becomes, the more difficult it is for the Ukrainians to maneuver or to conduct operations or to rest. And the denser the number of troops is in a smaller area, the easier it becomes for the Russians to bomb and to shell them. The humane thing for Zelensky and Syrskyi to do is to order the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk to lay down their arms. After all, it's likely that at some point over the next few weeks, the Russians would allow them to return alive and in one piece to Ukraine, where some of them, no doubt, would be immediately re-enlisted and sent into the battle. It's one of the paradoxes of this war that the Russians have shown a repeated willingness to release prisoners, even as the number of prisoners that Ukraine holds and can exchange in return has dwindled. But anyway, it is something that the Russians have done. So, allowing the troops in Pokrovsk to surrender would not only be a humane thing, it would also, long term, mean that these were soldiers who would return to Ukraine and, in most cases, re-enlist. But of course, Zelensky and Syrskyi are not going to do that. Not only because they object to surrenders on principle anyway, which is something that they have repeatedly shown throughout the war, but because authorizing soldiers to surrender would confirm to Zelensky's American and European friends that he has been lying all along. He has been telling them that Ukraine is successfully holding the Russians at bay. He has been telling them that the Russians are making no progress at all and that it is Ukraine that is winning the war. He appears to have told Kellogg, there are some reports that are circulating which suggest this. He appears to have told Kellogg and perhaps Trump that Ukraine was about to go on the attack, that it was preparing to launch an offensive of its own. Now, the time to do that basically this year has basically passed. We are now in the autumn, the Rasputitsa period. Soon it will be the winter. Ukraine has never conducted successful offensives in the winter, and I can't imagine that that is really going to happen now. But anyway, this is what apparently Zelensky told Trump and Kellogg and others. So how does he come and explain to all of these people a mass surrender of thousands of Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk when he has been telling them and been telling the Western media and been planting stories across the Western media saying the diametrically opposite thing? So for that reason, in order at least to keep the narrative going, at least for a few weeks more, until he can come up with a new narrative that he can spin to his listeners, his gullible listeners in the West, Zelensky is going to insist that these unfortunate men in Pokrovsk must keep on fighting and dying to no conceivable purpose. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. There was a very interesting article, I think, in The Guardian, discussing the situation in Konstantinovka, the big town to the east of Pokrovsk, which the Russians broke into a few days ago, a few weeks ago actually, and where apparently the Russians have been gradually gaining more and more ground and have been pushing deeper and deeper inside Konstantinovka. Now, it's interesting because the journalist in question, the British journalist in question, was actually reporting from Konstantinovka itself. So this is a fairly big place. He obviously wasn't aware that there were Russian troops in Konstantinovka. And the Ukrainians that he spoke with were at pains to assure him that there were no Russians in Pokrovsk. Obviously, this was reporting that preceded Zelensky's recent admissions. But of course, they could not conceal the critical situation in most other respects. That the Russians have achieved complete drone dominance, that Ukrainian troops have nowhere basically that they can hide, that for the Ukrainians reaching the front lines through the well, I won't call them drone walls, but across territory, roads and fields over which the Russian drones have almost complete aerial dominance, that this is becoming massively difficult, and that there is nowhere to rest, basically, and there is nowhere to hide, and that there is a shortage of infantry defending Konstantinovka as well. Now, there are, of course, the usual tropes about the Russians, that the Russians attack, and they attack without taking any precautions about how to defend themselves. I have seen huge amount of video footage of the war, mostly provided by the Ukrainians, by the way, and I have never seen in any footage Russian soldiers attacking in that kind of way. There's always been at least attempts by the Russians to avoid being hit by Ukrainian fire. But anyway, so there's some of that in this article. And always there's the implication that the Ukrainians are also able to strike at the Russians with their drones. But of course, in Ukraine itself, the Ukrainian media, Ukrainian commentators have increasingly been acknowledging the actual truth that the drones, Ukrainian drones, are no longer as effective or as numerous as the Russians, that it is the Russians, with their enormous industrial capabilities, that are decisively ahead in the drone war. I would add that one of the recent videos that I saw of the fighting in Pokrovsk, in Konstantinovka, showed, it is autumn after all, showed the fighting taking place in conditions of heavy fog and cloud cover. I understand that it makes it all but impossible for Ukrainian drones to operate, whereas the Russian drones, many of which are bigger and heavier and more powerful, can. And of course they can see through the fog because many of them have thermal images and similar devices, so that they're not as obstructed in understanding the battle as the Ukrainians are. Anyway, that was from Konstantinovka. Now, in Kupiansk, the reports say that things for the Ukrainians have become much grimmer than in Pokrovsk itself. It seems that the Ukrainian troops trapped on the east bank of the Oskol River have even less cover than the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk do, and that they are suffering increasing privations as a result of the bad weather and the shortages of supplies. And their attempts to break out have been unsuccessful. General Drapati, the Ukrainian ground forces chief, ordered them to withdraw, to try to withdraw from Kupiansk. But when they have tried to do so by crossing the Oskol River, they have found it all but impossible. And there are reports now that the Russians are gathering forces in Kupiansk itself and intend to advance south from Kupiansk, the core area of the residential area of Kupiansk, along the west bank of the Oskol River, capturing more settlements and, if you like, outlying suburbs of Kupiansk. But in any event, tightening further the trap the Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk, on the east bank, in the industrial sector of Kupiansk, are facing. Again, the humane and wise thing to do would be to order these men to surrender. But of course, for the same reason as the one I discussed a moment ago, Zelensky and Siersky will never agree to have that done. Now, not far from Kupiansk, it looks as if things are starting to take increasingly more dramatic turns. There are reports this morning that the village of Yampol, the important strategic village of Yampol, which lies between Liman and Siversk, has now been fully captured by the Russians. It's expected that the Russian Defense Ministry will confirm that within the next couple of hours or days. That means that the Russians now control the two main villages between Siversk and Liman, which are Yampol and Dronivka. To my mind, that effectively seals the cauldron around Siversk itself. I don't know how many Ukrainian troops are in Siversk, but given how they have fought, I'm guessing they are some of Ukraine's best. Anyway, they're now going to be trapped in Siversk if this information is true. But perhaps even more dramatically, there's been footage and map changes released by the various mapping projects, which now show that the Russians have indeed built up a large force immediately outside Liman, under cover of a forest, a wooded area, and apparently the bridges that cross, I presume it is the Seversky Donets River, leading to Liman, across which all the supply roads into Liman must pass. Apparently those roads have been destroyed as well. In which case Liman itself is cut off from resupply. There's apparently 3 battalions of Ukrainian troops in Liman. A rough guess, perhaps 700 men in total, just saying, because I don't believe that Ukrainian battalions are remotely up to strength. But anyway, let's say 700 men. I wonder whether Liman can be defended for very long. I gather that the way in which the town is laid out makes that rather difficult. Anyway, no doubt we shall find out very soon, because the attack on Liman is clearly coming. There are some commentators who are suggesting that this entire area, Siversk, Liman, is in effect another big cauldron, that all of these places are interconnected, and that there are also Ukrainian troops who are basically trapped in the open country. But my ability to read and understand maps makes it very difficult for me to say whether or not that is correct. Elsewhere still, the remorseless Russian advance westwards towards the city of Zaporozhye, which is at the river, the Dnieper, continues. The Russians have captured more towns or villages, perhaps, in Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk region over the last 24 hours. I suspect that in the end, this is going to be the most important theatre of all, because once Donbass comes entirely under Russian control, the focus will be on the advance towards the Dnieper. But this is still, if you like, the big battle that will happen probably next year, rather than the big battle that is happening now. And if we go north to Kharkiv, it looks as if the Russians have now indeed captured all of the remaining important positions in Volchansk, south of the Volcha, river. They seem to be advancing beyond Volchansk and capturing villages to the south of Volchansk. There is apparently a large Russian operation being prepared in North Kharkiv region. If it is executed in the way that some mapping projects say, then a large stretch of Kharkiv region is about to fall under Russian control. Most importantly, however, once that has happened, the Russians will be again outside the city of Kharkiv itself. Of course, they were that back in 2022, and they never captured or tried to capture Kharkiv then. But today, the Russians are very, very much stronger, and the Ukrainians, by contrast, are becoming much, much weaker. So a whole dialogue, a whole narrative has been spun in the West, again about a bogged down Russian offensive that fairly soon is going to prove to be untrue. I wonder, well, not so much what the Western media is going to say at that point. I can already imagine some of the articles that are going to be spun about how the loss of the Donbass, the Russian arrival on the Dnieper is not actually that significant after all. There will be all kinds of claims and stories spread about this, even as quietly the panic will begin to grow again, and Macron will resume his proposals for Western troops to be deployed to Ukraine and all that. But I wonder what will happen when Trump himself realizes that he threw away the chance of a deal in Anchorage, in part because of his own weakness, but mostly, or at least in part at least, because of the lies that Zelensky and Syrskyi had been telling him, and which others like Kellogg and Rubio maybe, and Waltz had been repeating. Anyway, that's Trump's problem for tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, for a few months' time. In the meantime, he has to wrestle with the problem of his meeting with Xi Jinping. And he might also, by the way, in the meantime, note something else, which is that India has just concluded a major co-production agreement with Russia to build Sukhoi civil airliners in India. It looks as if the Indians and the Russians are continuing their economic cooperation despite all of Trump's threats and sanctions and all of that. But that is something I'm going to talk about in my next program. This is where today's program ends. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumbles, and X. Don't forget also to check out our Substack site, and you can also go to our shop. Links under this video, and of course, please remember, if you've liked the video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.